The gun was still warm, sitting on the wooden counter between them. Maren didn't look at it. She looked at the dark stain spreading across the floor she had mopped an hour ago, then up at the man who had brought the violence to the door of her cafe. He didn't look sorry. He just looked tired. Maren Holloway was 27 years old, pouring coffee on the late shift at a small place down by the South Boston docks, and she was used to having things taken from her. They took her father when she was 12. They took the career she had traded her entire youth to earn, on the strength of an accusation she had nothing to do with. And then they took her younger brother, in a way that was crueler than dying. She had thought there was nothing left in her to lose. The man stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but he backed her against the edge of the counter, and the whole room seemed to shrink around the two of them. His thumb came up and caught the tear sliding down her cheek, a gesture far too gentle to belong to that hand. "You're going to lose more," he said, his voice low and rough, "but this time you won't lose it alone." Maren stood perfectly still. She didn't know whether he meant the war outside, or the men hunting him, or her. It would be a long time before she understood that her life had been tied to this war 3 years earlier without her ever knowing it, and only then would she feel the full weight of those words. But it all began on the night of the first snow, at 1 a.m, with 3 heavy blows against the glass of the cafe door. If Maren's story stayed with you, tap that like button and let us know we're on the right track. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And don't forget to subscribe, there's another story waiting for you next week. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Ferris Street Coffee held nothing but Maren and the fading hum of the espresso machine as it slowly cooled. She turned each chair upside down on its table in the same order she'd followed for the past 4 years, beginning in the farthest corner and working her way toward the door, because that way she wouldn't have to keep her back to the glass for too long at a time. Outside, the first snow of the season had been falling since early evening. The thin, wet snow of a Boston December, melting the instant it touched the pavement, but lingering just long enough to gather on the roofs of the cars parked along the curb. She wiped the steam wand, rinsed the drip tray, and shut off the water valve. The good thing about working the night shift near the harbor was that no one talked to her, and the bad thing was that no one talked to her. Estelle had left at 9, abandoning a note on the cash register, reminding her to lock both the upper bolt and the lower one, as though Maren had forgotten even once in 4 years. When everything was clean, she opened the drawer beneath the counter and took out the tin box that held the tips. She poured the money onto the wooden surface, pushed the coins into a separate pile, then smoothed each bill flat with the edge of her hand. Tonight, she'd made $41. A regular customer who worked the morning shift at the docks had left 5 because she remembered that he took his coffee without sugar. 3 college boys had stayed until midnight, ordered 2 drinks, and left $1 and a paper cup standing upside down on the table. She added it all in her head without paper or pencil, the habit of someone who had once counted gauze pads and needles in a room where being off by one meant someone had to reopen an incision. She slipped the stack of bills into an envelope already marked with the words Marlow Ridge in December written beneath them in her own bold, decisive handwriting. Then, she counted it once more. She was still $340 short. She stood staring at the envelope longer than necessary. 11 days remained before the payment was due. 3 extra shifts at the laundromat would bring in about $200, and if the weather didn't turn too bad, this week's tips might cover the rest. Maybe it would be enough. Maybe it wouldn't. She'd lived by calculations like these for so long that they no longer frightened her. They only made her tired. Maren switched off the lights over the counter, leaving one small bulb glowing behind the espresso machine, then went through the side door and climbed the wooden stairs to the loft. The room above the coffee shop had once been used for storage, before the former owner divided it into living quarters, and the ceiling was so low that she had to bow her head whenever she passed beneath the pipes. She rented it for $400 less than the going rate, in exchange for the smell of roasted coffee that seeped into everything, and the sound of delivery trucks moving in and out of the harbor at 5 o'clock in the morning. She didn't complain. Being only 14 steps from work was a luxury she'd learned to appreciate. She opened the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet beside her bed, where she kept her papers. On top sat a stack of bills from Marlow Ridge arranged by month, thinning toward the back, each page proof of another time she'd managed to find a way through. She placed the new envelope on top. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath all of it, lay an ivory-colored envelope that had browned at all 4 corners. There was no writing on it. It had remained in that same place since the day she moved out of her old apartment. And before that, it had been kept in a shoebox. And before that, it had stayed in the pocket of her coat for 2 straight weeks. Marin looked at it for about 3 seconds. Then she pushed the drawer shut and listened to the small lock click into place. She hadn't opened it in 3 years. She went back downstairs, sat on the tall stool behind the counter, the only place in the building that truly felt like hers, took out her phone, opened the voice recording app, and pressed the red button. "It's me, Ezra." Her voice changed the moment she spoke those first words, growing softer, warmer, becoming a voice she used for no one else in the world. The shop was unbelievably busy today. A whole crew from dock number 7 came in at 10, and I was making drinks so fast I could barely breathe. This one man ordered coffee, and then spent 40 minutes telling me how his dog knows how to open the refrigerator. I listened to the whole story, and afterward, he left a $1 tip. She laughed softly, naturally, as though her younger brother were sitting right across the counter from her. "It's snowing now, the first snow of the season. Do you remember when you were little and you'd insist on standing outside until your hands went completely numb, and Mom would keep calling you, but you wouldn't come in?" She paused for a moment. Outside, a car moved slowly past the end of the street, its headlights sweeping across the glass before disappearing. "I've almost taken care of this month's payment, so don't worry about anything. I've got the numbers all worked out." It was the only sentence in the entire recording that wasn't true, and she said it so calmly that she nearly believed it herself. "Sleep well, okay? I'll tell you more tomorrow." She pressed stop, sent the recording, and watched the small circle spin on the screen until it turned into a check mark. She didn't know whether anyone ever played these messages for Ezra. She'd asked 3 times, and all 3 times she'd received the same courteous hospital answer, that they would try, that it depended on his daily schedule. But she still recorded one every night, and had done so for more than 1,000 nights, because if she stopped, then the past 3 years would become nothing but one long silence, and she wasn't ready to live inside that silence. Marin slipped the phone into her apron pocket, stood up, and reached for the final switch behind the espresso machine. Her fingers had only just touched the switch when the first sound came. A heavy, muffled thud struck the front window from outside. Marin stopped. She didn't turn around at once. She remained exactly where she was, one hand still resting on the switch, and waited. 4 years of working the night shift near the harbor had long ago burned the instinct to startle out of her. All kinds of things struck the glass on Ferris Street after dark. A gust of wind knocked over a trash can. Drunken men stumbling out of the bar at the end of the block lurched into the window, then wandered away laughing. A seagull flew straight into the glass after mistaking the light for open space. She had learned that the frightening sound wasn't the first one, but the second, because the first could be an accident, while the second was always deliberate. The second thud came about a handspan lower than the first. Marin stepped down from the wooden riser, moved around behind the counter, and reached into the lowest compartment, where Estelle kept an old ashwood baseball bat with black tape wrapped around the handle. She picked it up without raising it, holding it straight against her leg, then walked into the middle of the shop. The third sound wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something heavy sliding slowly down the glass with a dragging friction, ending in a soft thump close to the ground. Marin looked outside. The only bulb still burning behind the espresso machine cast a weak yellow glow, just enough for her to see that the lower part of the window had fogged over, and across it ran a dark streak from chest height all the way down to the sill. Someone was sitting against the door of her shop. She moved closer, taking 3 steps at a time, and stopped exactly an arm's length from the entrance. A man sat on the concrete step with his back against the doorframe, one leg bent and the other stretched straight across the sidewalk. Snow had gathered in a thin layer over his shoulders and in his short black hair, which was wet and plastered against his forehead. One hand pressed hard against his right side, his fingers digging deep into the fabric as though he were trying to keep something from spilling out. His other hand hung loosely over his knee. Marin watched him through the glass for about 10 seconds. She didn't unlock the door. She didn't call anyone. She only looked, and while she looked, her mind began doing what it had done for so many years. The one thing no one had been able to take from her, even after they'd taken everything else. His skin was pale, but not gray. There was still color in his lips. He could still sit upright, which meant his blood pressure hadn't collapsed completely. The blood was soaking through steadily rather than pulsing with each heartbeat, which meant no major artery had been hit. He had roughly half an hour if he stayed still, less if he moved. She tapped her knuckles against the glass. The man lifted his head, and that was when every calculation in her mind faltered for a beat. She had seen every kind of dying person there was. They panicked. They begged. They clutched at someone's sleeve and asked the same question over and over again. This man didn't. He looked at her with dark green eyes, fully conscious, fully present, and there wasn't the slightest trace of pleading in his gaze. It was the look of a man who had missed a flight. Irritated, not threatened. Maren unlatched the upper bolt, left the lower one secured, and opened the door no wider than the breadth of her hand. Cold air and the smell of wet snow slipped inside. "I'm closed," she said. "Kearney Hospital is 4 blocks from here. Go straight down this street, then turn left at the red light." The man didn't move. "Can't," he said. His voice was rough and low, breaking halfway through the word on a short breath. She stood behind the narrow opening, one hand still holding the bat against her leg. "Then call an ambulance. Everyone knows the number." "Can't." He said it again, as calmly as though he were refusing a cup of coffee. And it was the way he said it that kept Maren from closing the door right then. People lied differently. When people lied, they explained. They rambled. They built stories about bar fights or car accidents. This man offered no explanation at all. He only repeated that single word, as though it were a fact about the world that she ought to understand without being told. He knew he would die on that sidewalk if she shut the door, and still he couldn't be bothered to invent a story. She understood that he couldn't go to a hospital, and she knew very well how many reasons there were in this world why a person couldn't go to one. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "I serve coffee." He didn't answer. He raised his free hand slowly, making sure she could see every movement, then pulled the edge of his coat aside. The yellow light from inside the shop caught on a patch of gray metal at his waist. He didn't draw it. He didn't point to it. He only held his coat open for exactly 3 seconds, then let it fall. And throughout those 3 seconds, he never looked away from her eyes. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. He was telling her precisely what kind of man stood before her so she could decide for herself, and that sent a colder shiver down Maren's spine than any gun aimed at her face ever could. She stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds to consider calling the police, then to think of the names that would be written into the report, the questions that would follow, and the people who would come looking afterward. 3 seconds to imagine closing the door, turning off the lights, going upstairs, and stepping over a frozen body outside her shop the next morning. 3 seconds to think of the envelope in the drawer that was still $340 short. Then she bent down, released the lower bolt, and pulled the door all the way open. "Don't bleed on the chairs," she said. "I just cleaned them." He couldn't stand up right away. Maren had to bend down, slide her shoulder beneath his arm, and lift, and she immediately understood that she was dealing with far more weight than she'd estimated through the glass. The man was heavy, not heavy with fat, but with broad bones and dense muscle, the kind of weight that forced her to brace one foot behind her to keep from falling. "Can you walk?" she asked, and he answered by taking a step. They moved past the counter, past the row of chairs turned upside down on the tables, and Maren didn't take him to any of them. She pushed open the swinging door to the back kitchen with her hip, pulled him through, and switched on the fluorescent light overhead. Harsh white light spilled across a long, narrow kitchen lined with shelves on both sides, with a stainless steel table in the middle where Estelle sliced bread and mixed salads for the morning shift. "Up here," she said. The man looked at the table, then at her, then placed both hands on the edge and lifted himself onto it. And Maren heard his breathing change halfway through the movement. A short breath pulled in and caught in his throat, but no groan followed it. She took a clean towel from the shelf, spread it beneath his head, then pressed lightly against his shoulder until he lay back. "Take off your coat." He didn't move. He looked at her, and his gaze was the same as it had been outside the door, alert and measuring, the gaze of a man who still hadn't decided what she was. Maren didn't wait. She took the fabric shears from the utensil drawer, the pair Estelle used to cut parchment paper, with broad blades and blunt tips. "If I have to cut this coat off you, I'm charging extra for the scissors," she said. One corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. Then he raised his hand and unfastened the coat himself, one button at a time, slowly, and when he pulled his shoulder free of the fabric, his entire face tightened for 1 second before settling back into place. Beneath it was a white shirt that was no longer white across the lower right side. Maren cut upward from the hem along his ribs, folded the fabric aside, and for the first time that night, saw exactly what she was facing. A small round hole with torn edges sat about 2 finger widths above his hip bone, leaking steadily rather than spurting. She slid one hand beneath his back, felt along his spine, then around his side, pressing one place at a time, and didn't find what she was looking for. "Is there an exit wound?" she asked. "Haven't seen one," he answered. Maren withdrew her hand and looked down at her palm. The bullet was still inside him. She went to the sink, turned the hot water on full, and began scrubbing her hands with the industrial soap the shop used for washing trays, twice over, beneath her nails, around her wrists, up her forearms to the elbows. As she scrubbed, she spoke in an even voice without turning around. "I don't have anesthetic. I've got half a vial of lidocaine for subcutaneous injection, expired last month. It'll numb the surface. The deeper I go, the less good it'll do. Do you understand me?" "I understand," he said. She placed a pot on the stove, filled it with water, and turned the flame high. Then she took out a pair of steel meat forceps, a long pair of tweezers, a curved suture needle, and a spool of thread from the first aid kit mounted on the wall, the kind Estelle had bought at a pharmacy and had never used for anything beyond an adhesive bandage. She dropped the forceps, tweezers, and needle into the boiling water and looked at the clock on the wall. While she waited, she spread a second clean towel across the stainless steel shelf beside the table and began arranging the instruments on it. She didn't place them carelessly. She set the forceps at the far left, tips pointing outward. The tweezers went beside them, parallel, spaced at exactly the same distance. The threaded needle rested below them, its curve facing upward. The gauze, already torn, was stacked in 3 piles, each one counted precisely. The bottle of saline stood open on her right, where she could reach it without looking. The cuffs of the disposable gloves were already turned outward. A small flashlight sat in the corner, its beam aimed inward. Everything lay exactly where her hand would search for it, in the exact order her hand would need it. And she did all of it, without stopping once to think. The man on the steel table turned his head and studied the shelf for a long time. "What did you do for a living?" he asked. Maren didn't answer. She put on the gloves, poured saline over the skin around the wound, patted it dry with gauze, then picked up the vial of lidocaine and drew the medication into a syringe, tapping the barrel lightly until the air bubbles rose to the top. She didn't answer because if she opened her mouth, she would have to say the thing that had been running through her mind for the past 10 minutes, and she hadn't said it aloud to anyone in 3 years. Her entire working life had been spent standing on the other side of a table exactly like this one. She was the person who placed the forceps into an outstretched hand. She was the person who counted the gauze before closure and counted it again afterward, then read the number aloud for the entire room to hear. She was the person who knew what the surgeon would need before he had time to call it by name, the person who stood for 8 straight hours without sitting down, the person whose face no one in the room remembered once the operation was over. She had watched hundreds of other hands do what she was about to do tonight. She knew every step, every rhythm, every place where a mistake could happen. She had simply never been allowed to do it with her own hands. And now, in this kitchen, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, there was no one holding out a hand for her to place an instrument into. There was no one counting with her. Her hands were the only hands in the room. She inserted the needle at the edge of the wound and began injecting in a circle around it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Cormac." Nothing followed the name. "All right, Cormac." She placed the syringe in the exact space she'd left for it and picked up the forceps. "I'm only going to say this once. I'm about to reach inside there. If you move, my hand slips, and directly beneath this spot is a blood vessel that will drain you before I can reach the phone. You'll die on the table where people slice bread every morning. Do you understand?" Cormac looked up at the ceiling, where the fluorescent light poured its harsh white glare across his face, then reached both hands behind him and gripped the edges of the steel table. "I won't move," he said, and he kept his word. Maren waited another 3 minutes for the lidocaine to take effect, then wedged the small flashlight between her shoulder and chin, angled it downward, and guided the tip of the forceps into the wound. The outer layer gave way easily, exactly as she'd expected. The anesthetic did the one job it was capable of doing, and nothing more. The moment the forceps reached the muscle, everything changed. She felt it through her fingertips before her eyes could register it. A new kind of resistance, denser, more alive. She looked up at his face for exactly half a second. Cormac was still staring at the ceiling. His jaw had tightened into a hard line. The muscles at his temples jumped once, and his hands gripped the edges of the steel table so fiercely that his knuckles had turned white. But he didn't make a sound. No groan, no sharp exhale, not a single noise escaped through his clenched teeth. Only his breathing changed, becoming shorter and faster, divided into groups of 4, as though he were counting each breath in his head to keep himself from breaking apart. "Tell me if you feel dizzy," she said. "If you can't speak, tap the table twice." He didn't answer. In that kitchen, only 3 sounds remained: his breathing, the quiet bubbling of the pot still boiling on the stove behind her, and the sound of metal touching metal each time she set one instrument on the tray and picked up another. Maren followed the path of the bullet. She didn't probe blindly. She moved along the direction of the torn tissue, slowly, advancing only a little at a time, before stopping to blot with gauze. She counted the pieces aloud in a low voice, for herself alone. 1, 2, 3. A habit she hadn't used in 3 years, yet it still lived inside her like a reflex no one had ever managed to remove. At 4 minutes, she asked, "Are you still conscious, Cormac?" "Still here," he said, and his voice was much rougher than it had been outside the door, but it remained level. "Good. Don't pass out. I can't lift you a second time." She heard him release a short breath through his nose, and she thought that might have been the way he laughed. At the 7th minute, the tip of the forceps struck something hard and smooth, and her entire arm went still. "There it is," she said. He said nothing. She opened the forceps, turned her wrist, searched for an edge, and closed them. They slipped. She tried again. They slipped again. On the 3rd attempt, she felt the tips lock into place and hold, and she began to pull. And that was the only moment all night when Cormac changed position. Not by jerking, but by driving his heels into the table and pressing his hips down, his whole body tightening like a rope drawn taut. And Maren spoke at once, her voice never rising. "Don't. Stay still. It's almost over." He stayed still. She pulled. The bullet came free of the wound and dropped into the stainless steel tray she'd placed beside him with a sharp, clean clink, a tiny sound that rang through the kitchen like a bell. Cormac released the edges of the table and let his head fall back onto the towel, and he breathed out slowly, the first breath in 7 minutes, that he hadn't needed to count. Maren didn't look at the bullet. She had already moved on to the next step before it stopped rolling in the tray. She flushed the wound with saline, patted it dry, inspected the inside again with the flashlight to make sure no fragments of cloth had been dragged into it, then picked up the curved needle and began to stitch. She worked slowly and evenly, placing every stitch at exactly the same distance from the next, and she did it with a calmness that surprised even her. There was no fear in her mind then, no curiosity, no questions about the man lying beneath her hands. There was only the needle, the thread, and the distance to the next stitch. When she finished, she covered the wound with gauze, wrapped it, and secured all 4 corners with tape. Then she stripped off the gloves, threw them into the trash, and went to the sink. Cormac pushed himself upright on one elbow. He looked down at the bandage around his side, then at the tray where the bullet lay, then at Maren standing with her back to him at the sink. "Your hands are steady," he said. "I've got rent to pay," Maren answered without turning around. She turned on the water, rinsed away the soap, dried her hands with a paper towel, and threw it into the trash. Only then did she turn back, lean one hip against the edge of the sink, and fold her arms. "You need antibiotics." "I don't have anything meant for this. I've only got some amoxicillin left over from when I had strep throat. It isn't strong enough, but it's better than nothing. Take 2 now, then 1 every 12 hours until they're gone. No alcohol. Keep the wound dry. If you have a fever after 48 hours, or if the area gets hot and the redness starts spreading, then you don't get to choose anymore. You go to a hospital, or you'll die from the infection instead of the bullet." Cormac nodded once. "And my fee," she said. "400 for the procedure. Another 600 for forgetting your face. Cash." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in that gaze had shifted since he'd been outside the door. An assessment had ended, and a conclusion had been reached. Then he slipped his uninjured hand into the inside pocket of the coat hanging over the shelf, drew out a roll of cash held together by a steel clip, and placed it on the table beside the tray containing the bullet. He didn't count it. He didn't separate any of it. He set down the entire roll. Then he reached for his coat, slid his arms into it, and walked toward the kitchen door. Maren didn't escort him. She remained where she was, leaning against the sink, and listened to his footsteps cross the front room, slow and heavy but steady. Then she heard the small brass bell above the front door ring exactly once, clear and brief. and after that came silence. She waited a little longer. Then she went to the steel table, picked up the roll of money, removed the clip, and counted it. $2,400. She counted it a second time because she thought she'd made a mistake. It was still $2,400, more than 2.5 times what she'd asked for. Marin stood there with the money in her hand, and she understood perfectly well that it wasn't kindness. People didn't overpay like that out of gratitude. They overpaid to close a ledger, so both sides understood that from that moment forward, neither owed the other anything, and there was no reason for them ever to meet again. It was a payment, and it carried a message that didn't need to be spoken. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door, the money still resting in her palm, and stayed there for a long time, long enough for half the water in the pot on the stove to boil away. Then she stood, turned off the burner, and went to get a cloth and a bottle of bleach. She wiped the steel table 3 times, carefully cleaning the 2 grooves along the edge where Estelle was always dropping breadcrumbs. Then she cleaned the floor, washed the tray, and carried the bullet out to the trash bin in the alley behind the shop. The next 2 days passed like every other day. A morning shift at the laundromat, an evening shift at the coffee shop, a voice recording sent to Ezra before she turned off the lights, and the only thing that changed was that she slept without switching off the small bulb behind the espresso machine. On the 3rd night, there was no snow, only sleet tapping against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse across the street. Marin closed 15 minutes earlier than usual, because only 4 customers had come in all evening. She was wiping down the wooden counter, the final cleaning of the day, when the front window exploded. It didn't crack first. The entire pane shattered at once with a dry, high burst, and thousands of pieces collapsed onto the tile floor in a long, crashing roar, as though someone had dumped an entire crate of bottles onto the ground. Marin threw herself behind the counter before the last shard had time to fall. She lay on her side with one cheek pressed to the floor, and from that exact position she heard boots grinding over broken glass. 2 men. Their steps were steady and unhurried. They didn't search the safe. They didn't touch the cash register, sitting only an arm's length from where she lay. The man in front stopped in the middle of the shop, and when he spoke, his voice was high and thin, the voice of someone trying to sound calmer than he really was. "Where is it?" Marin didn't answer immediately. She reached beneath the counter for the baseball bat, and her fingers found empty space. And then she remembered that Estelle had borrowed it that morning to prop open the stockroom door after one of the hinges had shifted. She placed both palms against the floor, exhaled once, then pushed herself to her feet. "The register is already open," she said. "Take whatever money is inside. As for the smaller safe under the counter, I don't have the code. The owner keeps it." The second man laughed. He was larger and held something metal hanging loosely at his side, and he swung it toward the shelves on the left, sweeping an entire row of ceramic mugs onto the floor. "Listen," he said. "We didn't come here for your money." The first man stepped closer to the counter. "The bar across the street has a camera pointed at the sidewalk," he said. "Monday night, 1:47 in the morning. A man was sitting on the ground outside your shop. Then the door opened. Then he went inside. 40 minutes later he walked out standing straight." "Explain that to me." Marin listened to every word, and while he spoke, her mind was moving quickly through a series of facts. The recording, 40 minutes. They had watched it, which meant they'd spent at least a day finding that bar and convincing someone to let them see the footage. That meant they hadn't started with the information. They were following it one step at a time, and if they were following it one step at a time, then they weren't certain. She lifted her head and answered in the flattest voice she had, the same voice she'd once used to call out gauze counts in a room full of tense people. "Some man knocked on the door close to 2 in the morning. He was drunk. He'd fallen somewhere and cut his knee. I let him sit inside for 15 minutes, gave him a glass of water, then told him to leave. He left. I didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it." 40 minutes, the first man repeated. "I had to clean the floor after he left," Marin said. "Look at this place and work it out for yourselves." Her eyes flicked toward the round clock hanging on the wall behind them, so quickly that even she barely registered what she'd done. 11:52. The second man came forward and swept the entire stack of paper trays off the counter. "You know what your problem is," he said. "Your problem is that man didn't go to a single hospital in this city. We checked every one of them. He was bleeding like that and never went to a hospital, which means somebody patched him up. And within 4 blocks, you were the only one open that night. I serve coffee," Marin said. "I don't patch up anything. The first man studied her for a long time. Then he spoke again, and his voice had changed. He was no longer trying to sound calm. "You're a very good liar, but I've been doing this for 10 years, and I know one thing. When people tell the truth, they get angry. When they lie, they stay calm. You're too calm." He jerked his head toward his partner. The second man walked around the counter. Maren stepped back once, and her spine struck the edge of the glass shelf. He lifted his foot, and a shadow stepped out of the dark hallway leading to the back kitchen. It didn't come through the front entrance, where both men were looking. It came from behind them, from the same narrow hallway Maren had helped a wounded man through 3 nights earlier, and it moved so quickly that she only saw a stretch of darkness slide across her vision. There was one brief, clean sound, unlike anything that had ever been heard inside that shop. The metal bar fell from the second man's hand, struck the tile, and rolled twice. The first man spun around and reached inside his coat. But the shadow was already there, and 2 more sounds followed, muffled and softer than the sleet striking the metal roof, separated by less than a heartbeat. Then everything stopped. Maren remained in the corner between the glass shelf and the counter, her arms hanging at her sides. The small light behind the espresso machine cast its glow over a tall man standing in the middle of the shop, and he was breathing, and he was looking at her. Cormac. He wore dark clothes, not the ones from the other night, and his weight was shifted slightly to the left, the posture of someone protecting one side of his body from pressure. He bent down, kicked the metal bar beneath a table, then took out his phone and pressed a single number. "Ferris Street," he said into it. "2. Bring the vehicle to the back door." He ended the call. Maren came around from behind the counter. She stepped through the broken glass and looked down at her tile floor, the floor she had cleaned at 11 o'clock. "I washed this floor an hour ago," she said. Cormac looked at her. Something very close to admiration crossed his face and disappeared. The vehicle arrived 8 minutes later, a charcoal pickup truck pulling into the rear alley without its lights on. 3 men came inside. None of them spoke to her. None of them looked at her for longer than a second. They worked like a team that had done this many times before. Within 20 minutes, Ferris Street Coffee had become the scene of a burglary. The cash safe had been pried open. The drawer beneath the counter had been pulled out and overturned. 2 tables had been knocked onto their sides. The marks on the floor were cleaned with a solution from an unmarked plastic bottle, then wiped again with the shop's own bleach, so the smell matched everything around it. One man swept the shattered glass into the middle of the walkway, then scattered some of it back across the sidewalk, in a pattern leading from outside in. The third man secured a sheet of plywood over the empty window frame. Maren stood in the corner of the shop and watched from beginning to end, and she didn't ask a single question because she understood exactly what she was seeing. In the morning, Estelle would receive a call telling her the shop had been robbed. She would swear, contact the insurance company, and complain that the neighborhood was getting worse every day. No one would call the police. In the South Boston Harbor District, people had learned a long time ago that calling the police only made things worse, that reports created questions. Questions brought people knocking at doors. And in the end, the person who always paid for all of it was the one left behind in the shop, not the one who had already gone. The pickup truck left the rear alley close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and when the sound of its engine finally disappeared at the end of the street, only 2 people remained inside the shop. Cormac stood beside the overturned table, with one hand braced against the back of a chair. Maren walked behind the counter and set the gun he'd handed her earlier on the wooden surface because she didn't know what else to do with it, then turned and looked straight at him. "Leave," she said. Cormac didn't move. "I mean it. Take everything that belongs to you. Walk out through that door, and never come back to this street again. 3 nights ago, I saved you. Tonight, you saved me. That makes us even. Neither of us owes the other anything. Now go." Her voice didn't rise, but it trembled at the end of the sentence, and she hated that tremor more than anything else that had happened that night. She pointed toward the sheet of plywood covering the place where the glass door had been. "Look at this shop. I've worked here for 4 years. Estelle has kept me alive for 4 years. She's 60 years old, and tomorrow she's going to cry over that door, and I'll have to stand there watching her cry while I lie to her." Cormac still didn't answer. He only watched her, and his silence made her keep talking. Faster now. "Do you know what frightened me most tonight? It wasn't the glass breaking. It was when that man said he'd checked every hospital in the city. He spent 2 days doing that. People don't spend 2 days on something small. I don't know who you are, and I don't want to know, But I know one thing for certain. You're the kind of man other people are willing to spend 2 days searching for. I'm not. I serve coffee. I'm at the bottom, and I've stayed at the bottom for 3 years, and I have my reasons. Once you walk out of here, I can go back to that bottom. Cormac didn't argue with a single word. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out his phone, opened the screen, swiped twice, then turned it around and held it in front of her. Maren didn't want to look, but she'd already looked. It was a photograph taken at night, slightly blurred and poorly lit, the kind of picture someone took from a distance through a car window. The frame showed the front of a low, 3-story red brick building, with a row of yellow lights running along the entrance. The camera was aimed at the 2nd floor. The 4th window from the left was glowing, its curtain drawn halfway, and on the sill sat a small plant Maren had carried there herself in September. A miniature cactus in a blue ceramic pot, the only thing in that room she'd chosen. In the lower right corner of the photograph was a small date and timestamp. Last night, 7:22 in the evening. Maren took the phone. She hadn't realized she'd reached for it. She stood there in the middle of the shop, amid the broken glass that had been swept into one corner, and stared at the photograph for a very long time, much longer than she needed to understand it. "You had someone watching my brother," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of the flat calm she'd held onto all night. "No," Cormac said. "This picture wasn't taken by one of my people. It was sent to me. At 10 o'clock this morning." Maren looked up. "From an unnamed number," he continued, his voice still as low and even as it had been when he was lying on the steel table. "No message. No demand. People don't send pictures like this to frighten you. They send them to show me they've found the thing I'll be made to pay with if I don't step back. Do you understand? They weren't sending a message to you. They were sending one to me through your brother's window." Maren lowered her eyes to the screen again. The 4th window. The cactus. The yellow lights at the entrance she'd walked beneath hundreds of times, every Sunday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, because 4 was when Ezra was most alert. For 3 years, she'd lived by a single belief, and she'd never spoken it aloud to anyone, not even to herself. The belief was this: everything had already been taken from her, and the price of losing everything was that she'd become invisible, and that invisibility was a blanket, and beneath that blanket the one person she had left could lie undisturbed. As long as she kept her head down, kept serving coffee, kept asking for nothing, filed no lawsuit, made no complaint, and never mentioned what had happened 3 years ago to anyone, Ezra would be safe. That was the agreement she'd signed with the world, and she'd paid every cent it demanded. She looked down at the cactus on the 2nd floor windowsill. That agreement had just broken apart in the palm of her hand. The man stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but he forced her back against the edge of the counter, and the entire room suddenly seemed to shrink around them. His thumb rose and caught the tear sliding down her cheek. "You're going to lose more," he said, his voice rough and low. "But this time, you won't lose it alone." Maren stood perfectly still. Then she placed the phone on the counter, walked past him, went through the side door, and climbed the 14 wooden steps to the loft. She pulled the canvas bag from beneath the bed. Into it she packed 2 sweaters, 1 pair of pants, underwear, a toothbrush, and her phone charger. She opened the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet, took out the stack of Marlow Ridge bills and the December envelope, then paused for a moment, reached all the way to the bottom, and removed the ivory-colored envelope that had browned at all 4 corners. She didn't open it. She slipped it between the 2 sweaters and zipped the bag shut. Downstairs, Cormac Fallon waited in the empty space where the glass door had once stood, half inside the shop and half outside in the night. Snow had begun falling again, the thin snow of December, and he let it gather on his shoulders without brushing it away. He listened to her footsteps moving across the ceiling, heard a drawer open and close, and thought about something he would never tell her. He'd had 36 hours to consider his options. He could have his men take her out of the state that very night, give her another name and enough money to begin again somewhere no one knew her, and he'd considered that plan the moment the photograph appeared on his screen. He hadn't chosen it. He told himself it was because the other option wasn't safe, because Halloran had people in more places than she could imagine, because how long could a woman running alone really survive? But standing there in the snow, listening to her footsteps above him, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was that 3 nights earlier, he'd lain flat on his back on a steel table in that kitchen, completely helpless, completely in the hands of a stranger, and that stranger hadn't trembled once. In 10 years, no one had ever looked at him without calculating how much he was worth or how dangerous he might be. She had only calculated how much longer he had to live. He heard the bag zipper close upstairs, and he understood perfectly well what he'd just done. He had pulled another person beneath the water, and she didn't even know how deep the lake was yet. The car drove for about 20 minutes, leaving behind the neighborhood she knew by heart. Passing a long stretch of road bordered only by chain-link fencing and rows of stacked shipping containers, then turning onto an old cobblestone street that ran close to the water. It stopped in front of a 4-story brick building, the kind of warehouse built back when the harbor was still thriving, with arched windows and thick walls. Cormac took her inside through a side passage and a steel door with no handle on the outside. Beyond it was a converted freight elevator, and he pressed his thumb against a small glass panel beside the doors before selecting a floor. The elevator rose and opened directly into a vast space that occupied the entire level, with ceilings twice the height of those in an ordinary home, exposed steel columns, and a row of windows running along the eastern wall overlooking the black water below. Maren stopped exactly where the elevator doors had opened, holding the canvas bag against her stomach, and looked around once. There were no photographs on the walls. Not a single one. She dropped the bag onto the wooden floor, and it landed with a heavy, insolent thud. "So I'm a hostage," she said. "You're a guest," Cormac replied. He took off his wet coat and draped it over the back of a chair. "Guests are allowed to leave," Maren said. Cormac turned and looked at her. "A guest who walks out through that door downstairs tonight will be found in the container yard tomorrow morning," he said, placing no emphasis on any word, as though he were reading the weather forecast. "You're staying here until I finish dealing with this. Then you can go home." "Who tells me when it's finished?" Maren asked. He didn't answer. He only pointed toward the far end of the room. "First bedroom on the right. There's hot water. Towels are in the cabinet. The elevator requires a fingerprint. The stairwell is locked from the outside. Not to keep you in, but because it's the only way to keep anyone else out. Don't try it." Then he disappeared into a hallway on the other side, leaving Maren alone in the middle of that enormous space with the bag at her feet. She waited until 2 o'clock in the morning. She lay on top of the blanket without unfolding it, eyes open, counting the rhythm of some machine running beneath the floor, and when the number had grown large enough for her to believe the entire level had gone to sleep, she sat up, carried her shoes in one hand, and opened the bedroom door by turning the handle very slowly before pulling it toward her. The hallway was long, with only 2 lights still burning, one at either end. She moved along the wall, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, and counted the doors. The first door on the right was hers. The second stood slightly open, completely dark, with the smell of old paper drifting from inside. The third was closed, and light showed beneath it, so she gave it a wide berth and walked more softly. The fourth was an alcove in the wall rather than a door. The fifth was the one she needed. A gray-painted steel door with the words marking it as an emergency exit almost entirely peeled away above it. She pushed, and it opened, and for 1 second her heart beat faster, because it had opened so easily. The concrete stairwell was narrow and much colder than the space outside it, and motion-sensitive lights came on one level at a time as she descended. She went down. There was a door at the 3rd floor landing. She tried it. Locked. She continued. At the 2nd floor, there was another door. Locked. She kept going, faster now, one hand gripping the iron railing, and when she reached the final landing, she saw it. The steel door at the bottom of the stairs, with a narrow line of light beneath it shining in from outside, the yellow glow of a street lamp beside the water. Maren placed both hands on the horizontal bar and pushed. It didn't move. She pushed again with her shoulder behind it, and heard metal strike. Metal on the other side, the unmistakable sound of a bolt secured from outside. She stepped back and looked at the door. Then she sat down on the final step. She didn't pound on it. She didn't call out. She sat there with her bare feet resting on the cold concrete floor, her shoes still held in one hand, and stared at the narrow strip of light beneath the door. Beyond it was the cobblestone street, the water, the city where she'd lived her entire life. Only one door away. The motion-sensitive light above her went dark because she'd been sitting still for too long, and she remained there in the darkness, unwilling even to move enough to make it come back on. She thought about how, for the past 3 years, she'd believed she was choosing her own life. She'd believed that serving coffee on the night shift was a choice, that keeping her head down was a choice, that refusing to file a lawsuit was a choice. Sitting on that stair, she understood that for all those 3 years, there had been a door exactly like this one, and she'd simply never gone down far enough to try pushing it. She didn't know how long she sat there. When her feet had gone completely numb, she stood, put on her shoes, and began climbing back up. The lights came on one level at a time with her steps, slowly, as though the building were reluctantly acknowledging her presence. She pushed open the emergency door on the top floor, stepped into the hallway, and stopped. A man was waiting at the far end. He looked close to 50, with broad shoulders, a thick neck, and a nose bent sharply to one side from a break that had never been properly set. He didn't block her path. He didn't ask where she'd been. He held 2 paper cups of coffee, and he extended one toward her. Maren looked at the coffee, then at him. Then she took it. It was still hot, which meant it had only just been poured, which meant he'd known she was down there and had waited long enough to make sure it would still be warm when she returned. "Gus Delaney," he said. That was all he said. Then he turned and walked toward the end of the hallway, leaving her alone with the hot coffee in her hand and the emergency door slowly closing behind her. The next morning, Maren woke at 6:30 because her body didn't know how to sleep any later than that, and when she reached the open kitchen, Gus Delaney was already sitting there with a newspaper folded into quarters and a plate holding 2 slices of toast in front of him. He nodded toward the coffee pot on the stove. "Still hot," he said. "Sugar is in the upper cabinet, on the left." Maren poured herself a cup without adding sugar and leaned against the stone counter across from him instead of sitting down. In the daylight, he looked older than she'd thought the night before, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and 2 large, rough hands resting on the table. "Where is he?" she asked. "Left at 5. He turned a page of the newspaper. "There are eggs in the refrigerator if you're hungry. No one is going to poison you." Maren didn't laugh. She took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and asked him directly the question she'd been thinking about ever since she'd sat on the concrete step the night before. "How long have you worked for him?" 11 years, Gus said. "Then answer this for me. What kind of man is Cormac Fallon?" Gus looked up. He studied her for a moment, and there was nothing hostile in his gaze, but there was no intention of making her comfortable either. "Do you want me to tell you something that will make you feel better? Or do you want the truth?" he asked. "The truth." He folded the newspaper, pushed it aside, and sat up straighter. "Then I'll tell you a story," he said. 4 nights ago, around 3 o'clock in the morning, a warehouse at Pier Number 9 caught fire. That warehouse belonged to us. It was empty. There was no cargo inside. Nothing at all. We'd moved everything out the week before. The man who burned it was named Ronan Halloran, Padraig Halloran's nephew, and Padraig controls the entire north side of this city. Ronan burned it to send my boss a message, something like, "If I can reach this place, I can reach the others." Gus paused and turned the plate in front of him in a small circle. "The warehouse really was empty," he said. "But do you know what wasn't empty? The roof. During the winter, people sleep on the roofs of abandoned warehouses around this harbor because they're sheltered from the wind up there, and the ventilation pipes give off warmth. Everyone who works at the harbor knows that. We know it. The Hallorans know it too." Ronan poured fuel into all 4 corners and set the place on fire at 3 in the morning without walking around once, without shouting a warning, without sending anyone up to see whether somebody might be there. He didn't check, not because he'd calculated that no one was there, because the thought never crossed his mind. Maren set her coffee cup on the stone counter. "Was anyone up there?" she asked. "Not that night," Gus said. "It was too cold, so they'd all gone down beneath the overpass. Lucky." He said the word lucky in a voice that made it sound nothing like luck. "My boss got the news at 3:20. He didn't say a word. He stood at that window over there for about 5 minutes, then went looking for Ronan Halloran that same night. He didn't wait until morning. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't ask anyone's opinion." Gus looked at Maren, and on the night he went looking for that man, he took a bullet. Then he walked 4 blocks and knocked on the door of your coffee shop. Maren said nothing. In her mind, she was arranging the sequence of events, and every piece fit together with an accuracy that made her uneasy. Gus stood, carried his plate to the sink, and continued speaking as he turned on the water. "I'm not telling you this so you'll think my boss is a good man. Don't make that mistake. He's done things you wouldn't be able to forgive, and I'm not going to sit here and defend every one of them. There have been nights when I followed him somewhere and came home the next morning unable to look my wife in the face. He shut off the water, dried his hands on the towel hanging beside the sink, and turned back toward her. But there is one line he has never crossed in the 11 years I've followed him. Women, children, and people who have nothing to do with any of it, untouched. Never used as leverage. Never used to send a message to anyone. The whole city knows that rule of the Fallon family, and that rule has cost him more than it's helped him, because it makes him predictable. And in this line of work, being predictable is dangerous. He keeps it anyway. Halloran, Gus said, and his voice changed slightly, has no line at all. It isn't that he's more cruel. It's that the line simply doesn't exist in his mind. To him, anywhere pressure can be applied, he applies it. The warehouse roof at 3 a.m. was no different, and neither is anything else. Do you understand the difference? Marin did. She understood it more clearly than Gus imagined, because for the past 3 years, she'd lived in a world full of people who had no such line in their minds, people who signed a name in a blank space, without needing to know who that name belonged to, people who closed a file at 5 p.m. and went home to dinner. She'd learned that most of the terrible things in the world didn't come from cruelty. They came from someone who couldn't be bothered to walk around once and check whether anyone was on the roof. She picked up her coffee and finished what had gone cold. "Aren't you afraid I'll tell someone all of this?" she asked. Gus picked up the newspaper and tucked it beneath his arm. "Who would you tell?" he said. Then he walked out of the kitchen, and at the doorway he paused for 1 second without looking back. "Don't go down that stairwell again," he said. "It's cold down there." Cormac returned close to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Marin heard the elevator before she saw him, and when he stepped out, she was standing in the kitchen washing the coffee cup she'd used that morning. He walked straight to the sink on the other side, turned on the faucet, and began running water over both hands. Marin watched. The knuckles of his right hand were split in 3 places, the skin blanched by the water and dirt caught along the edges. He rinsed them the way someone might wash a frying pan, without looking or checking, and he was about to turn off the water when she spoke. "Sit down." Cormac stopped. He turned his head and looked at her. "I told you to sit down," she repeated. She went to the cabinet on the wall, where she'd found the first aid kit that morning while searching for what she needed to make coffee, and pulled it down. It was much heavier and better stocked than the one at the shop, the kind of kit people bought only when they knew for certain it would be used. She carried it to the dining table and set it down. Cormac looked at the box, then at her, then pulled out a chair and sat. He placed both hands on the table, palms facing upward, and said nothing. Marin took the chair across from him. She removed the tweezers, gauze, and antiseptic solution, and worked on his hand in the same order she did everything in her life, from the outside inward, from the simple parts to the difficult ones. "There's something lodged in the middle knuckle," she said. "You won't wash it out." "I know," he said. She closed the tweezers around it, removed a small white fragment, probably wall paint, and dropped it onto the table. "This is going to sting." Cormac didn't answer. She poured antiseptic onto the gauze and pressed it against his knuckle, and he didn't pull his hand away or tighten his face. Only his thumb moved slightly, then became still again. For the next several minutes, neither of them spoke. Somewhere outside, the distant horn of a ship carried across the water. Then Marin said without looking up, "Gus told me about the warehouse at Pier Number 9. Cormac was silent for a moment. "He said more than I expected him to," he replied. "He said there's a line you've never crossed. That's what he said. Not me." She pulled a strip of bandage from the roll, cut it with the scissors in the kit, and began wrapping it around the knuckle of his index finger. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. 10 years. "How old were you when you started?" 24. Marin's hands paused for exactly 1 beat before continuing. "At 24, people are still in school," she said. "Some people are," Cormac replied. She cut the bandage and secured the end. Then she moved to his middle finger. "Who gave this to you?" she asked. "No one gave it to me." "Then why are you the one sitting in that position?" He looked down at his hand resting in hers. "Because I'm the one who was left," he said. Marin looked up. Cormac didn't look at her. He stared at the small white flake of paint lying on the table. "I had an older brother," he said. "Brannon. 4 years older than me. He was the one who was supposed to sit in this position." She drew the bandage over his knuckle, held it in place, and wrapped it once more. "He was born for it," Cormac said. He knew the names of every wife and child belonging to every man at the harbor. He remembered who had just come out of surgery, who had just lost a mother, and who was behind on medical bills. People followed him because they wanted to, not because they were afraid. I was studying structural engineering at Northeastern then. My final year. Maren cut the bandage. Then what happened? She asked. Then there was one night, he said. 3 o'clock in the morning. She held out her hand, and he placed his other one in it. And she began again from the start, with the knuckles on his left hand. These were less damaged, only scraped. Our house caught fire, he said. My father was inside. She cleaned the scrape with gauze, slowly. My brother dragged him as far as the yard, Cormac said. Then he went back inside because he thought someone was still in the kitchen. There wasn't anyone. He made it back out, but he came out with this. He lifted his left arm and turned the inside toward her. An old burn scar ran from his wrist almost to his elbow, the skin smooth and darker than the flesh around it. Not his, he said. Mine. I went in after him. Maren studied the scar for a moment, then lowered his arm to the table. Did your father die that night? She asked. Yes. And your brother? Cormac was quiet longer this time. 3 years later, he said. She cut the final strip of bandage and secured it. Done. Don't wash your hands in hot water for 2 days. If any of these places start throbbing instead of merely stinging, call me. He bent and straightened his fingers once, examined the bandages, then stood. Thank you, he said. It was the first time he'd ever said those words to her. Maren gathered the dirty gauze into her palm, threw it away, closed the first aid kit, and carried it back to put it away. She vaguely remembered taking it from the kitchen cabinet. But the shelf was high, and she was holding the box with both hands, so she turned toward the low bookcase against the wall in the outer room and meant to leave it there temporarily. The edge of the box struck the spine of a hardbound notebook leaning at the end of the shelf. The notebook fell, and a photograph slipped from between its pages and landed on the wooden floor. Maren set down the box and bent to pick it up. It was a printed photograph, its edges faded with age, taken outdoors. 2 men stood beside each other. The one on the right was Cormac, much younger, with no gray anywhere in his hair, wearing half a smile as though someone had caught him in the middle of being persuaded to laugh. The man on the left was slightly taller, broader through the shoulders, with one arm draped around his younger brother's neck. But Maren wasn't looking at either of them. She was looking at the building behind them. Cream-colored brick, wide glass doors, and above the entrance, a metal canopy bearing a line of words she didn't need to read to know what they said, because she'd walked beneath that canopy 4 times a week for 6 straight years. There was another detail beside the right side of the doorway that only someone who had worked there would notice. A granite column with one corner chipped away after an ambulance had backed into it. Maren's fingers tightened around the edge of the photograph. Where was this taken? She asked, and she heard her own voice come out perfectly normal. Cormac was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked over, saw the photograph in her hand, and his expression didn't change. Mercy, General, he said. It was taken before my brother went in there. He lifted his glass of water and took a drink. He died there, he said. Operating room number 4. Maren said nothing. She bent down, picked up the hardbound notebook, slipped the photograph between 2 old pages, and returned it to its original place at the end of the bookshelf, its spine aligned neatly with the books beside it. Then she lifted the first aid kit, carried it into the kitchen, set it on the stone counter, and turned on the faucet. She washed her hands. Hot water, soap, twice over, beneath the nails, around the wrists, up the forearms to the elbows. When she finished, she washed them again. Her thumb rubbed circles into the opposite palm, then between the fingers, then across the backs of her hands, following the exact 6-step sequence she'd been taught when she was 21 and had repeated no fewer than 10,000 times in her life. The water kept running. She stood with her head bowed over the sink, and inside her mind, the night of February 9th 3 years earlier, opened like a drawer that had never been fully closed. She had worked the second shift that night. 9 o'clock in the evening, operating room number 4. The first case had been an elderly man with a fractured femoral neck, finished at 11. She remembered managing to eat half a sandwich in the break room before the announcement came over the speaker. Emergency case. Male patient, 31 years old, penetrating abdominal wound, blood pressure falling. On his way up, she remembered running. She remembered the wheels of the stretcher striking the double doors. She remembered that the man on the stretcher was tall, with black hair, and she remembered how completely the blood had soaked through everything. She remembered laying out the drapes, opening the tray, counting the gauze for the first time, and calling the number aloud for the entire room to hear. 20. She remembered the anesthesiologist's voice. She remembered placing the clamp into the surgeon's waiting palm before he had time to ask for it, because she'd stood beside him long enough to know what he would need and at what moment he would need it. She remembered the instant everything began to go wrong. The heart rhythm on the monitor moved along a path it was never supposed to take. She remembered the anesthesiologist's voice changing, rising higher as he asked about the medication dose a second time and then a third. She remembered someone saying something she couldn't quite hear. She remembered remaining exactly where she was, one hand holding the tray, her eyes fixed on the surgical field, because that was her job, to stand still, to stay ready, and never to leave her position no matter what was happening. She remembered counting the gauze a second time. 20. She called the number aloud in a room where no one was listening anymore, and she remembered looking at the clock on the wall when they stopped. 1:17 in the morning. She remembered every minute of that night. For 3 years, she hadn't told anyone about it, not even Ezra in the recordings she sent him, not even herself in the middle of the night. But she hadn't forgotten a single detail, because people didn't forget the night their lives were cut in two. Maren shut off the faucet. Her hands had turned red from the heat. She stood there as water dripped from her fingertips into the basin, and she thought about the man who had been sitting across from her 10 minutes earlier, the man who had placed both hands in front of her and allowed her to bandage them without asking a single question, the man who had just told her about a night at 3 o'clock in the morning and a scar along his forearm. What would happen if she walked out now and told him she'd been in that room, that she had been the fourth person from the left, standing at the head of the table with the instrument tray, the person who had called out the number 20 at the moment his brother stopped breathing? She knew what would happen. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't do anything at all. He would only look at her, and from that second forward, every time he looked at her, he would no longer see the woman who had opened the coffee shop door at 2 o'clock in the morning. He would see the night he lost everything, and Maren, who had lost her father, her profession, and her brother, who had spent 3 years living beneath a blanket of invisibility, understood something about herself that gave her no pride at all. She couldn't bear to be looked at that way one more time. She dried her hands on the towel, folded it, hung it back on the hook, and decided to remain silent. She told herself it was only temporary, that once everything outside was settled, she would tell him, that saying it now wouldn't change anything for the man who was gone. She'd lived long enough to know that thoughts like those were always the thoughts of someone preparing to do something wrong. That afternoon, downstairs, in the room behind the third door Maren had carefully avoided at 2 o'clock that morning, Cormac sat before a thin stack of papers. His people had spent 4 days gathering it. Maren Holloway, 27 years old, born in Quincy, father died when she was 12, studied nursing for 2 years, then transferred into the surgical technologist program and graduated with honors. Joined Mercy General at 21. 3 years. Left her position 3 years earlier. In her personnel file, the reason for termination was recorded in a vague administrative phrase, with no details, no accompanying report, and no appeal filed by her. Cormac turned to the second file. This was the one he'd kept for 3 years, a copy of Brannan's surgical record, and he'd read it so many times that he knew every timestamp by heart. He opened it to the list of staff on duty the night of February 9th. Attending surgeon, assistant surgeon, anesthesiologist, circulating nurse, surgical technologist, and on that line was a name he'd never paid attention to before, a different name. He turned to the department schedule for that week. Second shift, operating room number 4, the night of February 9th, Maren Holloway. He placed the 2 files beside each other and stared at them for a very long time. She had worked that exact shift. She had been in that building, on that floor, inside that room. But throughout the entire surgical record, from the first page to the last, there wasn't a single line bearing her name. It hadn't been entered incorrectly. It hadn't been confused with someone else's. It simply wasn't there. Cormac Fallon had spent 10 years in a world where people lied to him every day, and he'd learned that the easiest lie to recognize wasn't the thing someone added, but the thing someone removed. A name didn't disappear from a hospital record on its own. Someone had to make the effort to erase it. He closed the file, picked up his phone, and called a number he used only when he wanted to dig deeper than anyone was willing to permit. 3 weeks passed, and Maren learned how to live inside a building she wasn't allowed to leave. She woke at 6:30 because her body didn't know any other way. She made coffee for the entire floor because no one had told her to do it, and no one had told her not to. She learned that Gus Delaney ate 2 slices of toast every morning and never ate 3. She learned that on some nights the elevator traveled up and down constantly, while on others it never moved at all. And the second kind of night was the more worrying one. By the second week, Cormac took her down to the basement. The basement was a long concrete corridor running the full length of the building, with several sandbags stacked against a wall reinforced with thick wooden panels at the far end, and 2 sets of ear protection resting on a table against the left wall. He handed her a small pistol, removed the magazine in front of her, pulled back the slide, and let her look inside. "Empty," he said. "Take it." She did. It was heavier than she'd expected. During the first lesson, he didn't let her fire a single shot. He only made her hold it, put it down, pick it up, point it toward the floor, point it at the sandbags, remove the magazine, insert it again, and work the slide until her wrist ached. "Keep your index finger along the frame," he said. "Don't put it on the trigger until you've made your decision." During the second lesson, he allowed her to fire 3 shots, and all 3 missed the sandbags. Her ears rang, her shoulder snapped backward, and she hated every part of it. "You're pulling the trigger like you're jerking something loose," he said. "Squeeze. Don't jerk." During the third lesson, he said nothing for the entire 20 minutes, and only stood behind her with one hand resting on the table. During the fourth, her second shot struck the upper edge of a sandbag, and sand began spilling out in a thin stream. Marin lowered the gun and stared at the hole. Cormac didn't praise her. He only said, 40 more rounds. Then he went upstairs. By the third week, she made a request, and she'd prepared an entire argument, but he nodded before she reached her second sentence. On Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a car took her to Marlow Ridge. Gus drove, Cormac sat in the front passenger seat, and neither of them said a word during the journey. The car stopped in the lot across the street, the same lot from which someone had aimed a camera at the second floor. Marin didn't look toward it. She entered through the main doors beneath the row of yellow lights and stopped at the reception desk, as she did every Sunday, to sign the register and ask for that month's bill. The young woman at the desk typed something into the computer, looked up, and spoke in the cheerful voice of someone who believed she was delivering good news. "Miss Holloway, this has all been paid." Marin looked at the screen. Not only December, not only the first quarter. It had been paid through the end of the following year. 30 minutes later, when she walked out through the main entrance, she crossed the parking lot without stopping, opened the car door, and spoke before Cormac had time to turn his head. "You bought me with my brother." Cormac opened his door and stepped out. Gus immediately walked around the front of the car and stood with his back to them, facing the road. "Did you know I was saving every dollar in tips?" Marin said. "Did you know I counted every shift at the laundromat? For 3 years, I made every payment. Every single month. Even the month I lived on instant noodles for 3 weeks. That was the only thing I could still do for him. And you paid 1.5 years in one stroke. Do you understand that you took that away from me too?" Cormac didn't argue. He stood there with both hands in the pockets of his coat and allowed her to finish. Then he spoke. "I paid it on the 2nd. Marin stopped. "The 2nd, he repeated. 2 days after the night at your coffee shop. Before those men broke the window. Before you knew my name. My people found this place within a day, and I had the money transferred the following afternoon." He looked at her. "I did it because I knew one thing for certain. If I'd asked you first, you wouldn't have accepted it. You took exactly $1,000 from me when you could have taken 10 times that. And when I watched you count the money on that steel table, I knew you were the kind of person who would rather go hungry than take something she hadn't earned. So I didn't ask." Marin stood motionless in the parking lot as the wind came in from the sea, and she couldn't find a single word to say. The worst part wasn't that he was wrong. The worst part was that he was right, and that he'd watched her closely enough during 40 minutes of one night to understand that about her, while there were people who had known her for 6 years and had never looked at her that long. She turned away and walked back into the building without another word. Second floor. 4th room from the left. Ezra was sitting at the table beside the window, and when she opened the door, he turned his head slowly. Then one corner of his mouth lifted. He was 22 years old, tall and thin, with the same copper-red hair as his sister, cut short. "It's me," Marin said, and she sat in the chair across from him. She told him about the snow. She told him about the customer who drank his coffee without sugar. She told him that she was staying somewhere else for a little while because the coffee shop was having its door repaired. Ezra watched her the entire time and occasionally nodded, and once he managed to say 2 words. The first was sister. She couldn't understand the second, but she nodded as though she had. He turned back to the papers on the table. He was still drawing, as always. The pencil moved slowly and heavily in his hand, pressing so hard into the paper that it tore in places. At 4:50, a nurse knocked on the door and said it was time for the group activity. Maren stood, kissed her brother on the forehead, and while she waited for someone to wheel him into the hallway, she gathered the drawings from the table as she did every Sunday, because he would throw them all away if she didn't take them. She smoothed them flat, folded them into quarters, and slipped them into the pocket of her coat. The pages were covered in overlapping, tangled pencil marks, and in the middle of them, repeated again and again, from one sheet to the next, were 3 large, distorted characters pressed so deeply into the paper that they left impressions on the reverse side. The doctor had explained it to her during the first year. It was repetitive behavior, very common after a traumatic brain injury, a way for the patient to soothe himself, like a child rubbing the corner of a blanket. Don't try to find meaning in it, Miss Holloway. You'll only exhaust yourself. Maren had believed that for 3 years. 3 nights later, the elevator moved at 11:40, and Maren knew at once that something was wrong, because it didn't stop on the lower floor as it usually did. It came straight up. The doors opened, and 2 men stepped out together, supporting a third between them who was moving on only 1 leg. Maren was already out of her chair before anyone had time to call her name. "Lay him down," she said. "Right here, on the wooden floor, not on the sofa. Keep his head low and raise his legs. Take every cushion off the couch." He looked about 22, thin and still young in the face, and Maren recognized him as the young man who had greeted her in the hallway the week before, with the words, "Hello, ma'am," then blushed and hurried away. "Micah," one of the other men said. "His name is Micah. We were at pier number 4. 3 men were waiting for us. He took a shot." Maren didn't hear the rest. She was already on her knees, cutting through the fabric of his trousers along the seam with the scissors she kept in her apron pocket out of habit. She looked for 1 second. Upper thigh, inner side. Blood coming in pulses. Not seeping, not flowing, but pulsing. "Call the vehicle," she said. "Call it now." "Already called," the man answered. "How long?" 15 minutes. Maren said nothing more. She lowered both hands, placed one over the other, found the exact point she needed in the crease of his groin, and pressed down with the full weight of her upper body. She had no vascular clamp. She had no proper tourniquet. She had no operating table, no surgical light, no one standing across from her to place instruments into her hand. She had 2 hands, and she had the knowledge of anatomy she'd gained from 6 years spent standing in a room where no one had allowed her to touch anything. "Micah," she called. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened. His pupils still reacted. "I hear you," he said. "Good. Look at the ceiling. Don't look down here. See that steel pipe running across it? Do you see it?" "Yes. Count the rivets for me." He began counting. By the time he reached 9, his voice had grown softer. Maren increased the pressure. Her lower hand had gone numb by the 2nd minute, but she didn't dare switch hands, because switching meant releasing him for half a second, and she knew exactly what half a second was worth. She lifted her eyes to the clock on the kitchen wall. 11:43. "Micah, keep counting," she said. "I'm tired," he said. "I know. Keep counting." 10, he said. 11. 12. Cormac returned during the 4th minute. He stepped out of the elevator, looked down at the floor, and didn't ask a single question. He only asked Maren what she needed. "Blankets," she said without looking up. "As many as you can find. He's getting cold." Then he sat down on the other side and held Micah's leg to keep him from moving. He did both things exactly as she'd asked. 11:46. Micah stopped counting. Maren called his name again, and this time his answer came 1 beat slower than before. She changed her approach. "Where are you from, Micah?" "Lynn," he said. "What's in Lynn?" He didn't answer immediately. "My mother," he said. "What's her name?" "Rosalie." "What does she do?" "She sells pastries." "What kind?" "Cannoli," he said, and he smiled, a very small, crooked smile. "She's terrible at making them." "Then tell me what she does wrong," Maren said. "Tell me slowly. Don't leave out a single detail," he told her. He told her the shells were too soft, the filling was too sweet, and that she only managed to sell them because the neighbors loved her, not because the pastries were good. Every time he fell silent for longer than 3 seconds, Maren asked another question and pulled him back. 11:51. She couldn't feel either hand below the wrists. Her shoulders trembled in waves from holding the same downward position for 11 straight minutes, and sweat ran along her spine even though the room was cold. At that exact moment, she thought of something very strange. She thought about how, during all 6 years at Mercy General, her job had been to stand still, remain ready, and wait for someone else to hold out a hand. She had stood still on the night of February 9th, while everything inside operating room number 4 slowly fell apart, because that had been her job, and for 3 years she'd wondered what might have happened if she hadn't stood still that night. She wasn't standing still now. Now her 2 hands were the only thing keeping this young man here, and she wouldn't let go no matter what happened. 11:54. The elevator moved. 2 people dressed in dark clothing stepped out with a folding stretcher and a hard medical case, and the one in front knelt immediately beside her, opened the case, and spoke in the voice of someone who had done this many times before. "I'm taking over. Count to 3, then lift your hands. I'll move into the same place immediately." Maren counted. 1, 2, 3. She raised her hands, and the other person pressed down in the same beat, and they managed it. And 30 seconds later, Micah was on the stretcher, with a real clamp in place, and an intravenous line running. He turned his head, searching for her. "Cannoli," he whispered. "Next time, I'll bring you one." "I'll eat it," Maren said. Then they left. The elevator doors closed. 3 people remained in the room, and the other 2 quietly walked into the hallway, and then only 2 were left. Maren was still kneeling on the wooden floor. She wanted to stand, but she couldn't. And when she looked down at her hands, she realized they were still holding the same shape, fingers curved and stacked over each other, rigid as 2 iron hooks. She tried to straighten them. They wouldn't move. She tried again, and a cramp shot from her wrist to her elbow, forcing a short breath from her lungs. Cormac came closer. He didn't help her stand. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He sat down on the wooden floor beside her with one leg bent, then reached out slowly enough to give her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. He took her upper hand between both of his and began opening her fingers one at a time, the little finger first. He pressed his thumb into her palm, massaging the muscle that had locked tight, then drew the finger straight, held it there for 3 seconds, and released it. Then the ring finger, then the middle finger. He worked very slowly without speaking, and when the upper hand had opened completely, he laid it on her thigh and took the lower one, the hand that had turned dark red and gone entirely numb, and began again. Maren sat still and let him do it. She watched his bandaged hands opening each of her fingers, and she said nothing, and there was only one thought in her mind, that this was the first time in 3 years anyone had touched her hands without trying to take something away. 2 days later, on an entirely ordinary afternoon, Cormac came out of the hallway on the other side and placed a stack of papers, about 2 finger widths thick, on the dining table, secured at one corner with a black metal clip. He didn't say anything. He pulled out a chair, sat at the opposite end of the table, 4 empty seats away from her, and gave a single nod toward the file. Maren looked at it. Then she wiped her hands on a towel, sat down, and opened the first page. The upper half was a copy of a page from the pharmacy department's medication dispensing log for the night of February 9th. 2 lines had been circled in pencil. The lower half was a comparison chart someone had recreated on a computer, clearly listing the batch number of the medication issued from storage to operating room number 4 that night, and the batch number of the vial recorded in the anesthesia report. The 2 batch numbers didn't match. Maren read those 2 lines 4 times. She wasn't a pharmacist, but she'd spent 6 years standing inside operating rooms, and she knew how tightly controlled that process was. She knew how many hands a vial had to pass through and how many signatures had to follow it before it reached the anesthesiologist. A vial didn't simply lose its way. She turned the page. The second page was a handwritten statement from a man named Dwyer, a pharmacy technician, dated 11 days earlier. His writing was shaky and slanted. He admitted that he'd accepted a cash payment to switch the positions of 2 vials on a tray before it was sent upstairs. He wrote that he'd only been told to make the exchange, that no one had explained why, and that he'd believed it would do nothing more than delay the operation. He wrote that he'd quit 6 months later and moved to another state. He wrote that he hadn't slept properly in 3 years. At the bottom of the page was another line in handwriting that wasn't his, naming the intermediary who had delivered the money. It was a surname Maren hadn't heard until 3 weeks earlier. Halloran. She kept turning the pages. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th pages were minutes from 3 internal hospital meetings held within 9 days of that night. She read slowly, one line at a time, and by the 2nd paragraph she understood that the people sitting in those meetings had never asked the real question. No one asked why the batch numbers were wrong. They asked only one question, repeating it again and again in different forms. If this becomes public, who will take responsibility? The attending surgeon had just been nominated to the medical board. The anesthesiologist was the son-in-law of a major donor. The circulating nurse had 23 years of service and a spotless record. By the 3rd set of minutes, there was one short, neatly written line, recorded as though it were an ordinary administrative decision. Responsibility will be assigned to the preparation and instrument count at the table. The surgical technologist in charge will end her employment by mutual agreement, without a disciplinary review, to prevent the creation of additional records. The final page was a staffing schedule that had been altered, and on the line naming the surgical technologist assigned to the night of February 9th, another name had been typed over the original. In the left margin, someone from Human Resources had written 2 words in ink, already changed. Maren placed one hand on the page. The room was very quiet. For 3 years, she'd lived with a story, and the story was this. She had been inside a room where something terrible happened, and someone had needed to carry the blame, and she had been the least important person there, and that was simply how life worked. She had called it bad luck. She had told herself that if she'd traded shifts with someone else that day, everything would have been different, that she'd merely been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had carried that thought to bed for more than 1,000 nights. Now she sat before those papers and understood that there had been no bad luck in any of it. 2 families had been fighting in this city since before she was born. One side had wanted a man dead, and they'd paid a pharmacy technician to make it happen in a cleaner way. The man had died. Then a committee of 5 people had sat inside an air-conditioned room and looked around the table for the cheapest name they could discard without cost. They had chosen hers. Not because she'd done anything wrong, because she was the person no one would ask about. Maren looked up. Cormac was watching her from the far end of the table. He had remained silent throughout the past 20 minutes. "I was in that room," she said. Her voice didn't break. It only grew quieter. The night of February 9th, I was working the 2nd shift. I was the one standing at the instrument tray. I handed the surgeon the clamps. I counted the gauze. I called out the numbers. I was there from the moment they wheeled your brother inside until 1:17 in the morning. She placed both hands on the table, the same hands whose fingers he had opened one by one 2 nights earlier. I saw the photograph when you told me about the fire. I recognized the building immediately, and I didn't say anything. I stayed silent for 3 weeks. Cormac said nothing for a very long time, long enough for Maren to hear a ship horn carrying in from the harbor. 2 calls, then silence. "I know," he said. Her head snapped up. "I've known for 3 weeks," he said. "I've known since the day you looked at that photograph. I took out my brother's surgical records and compared them with the department schedule, and I saw your name on the schedule but not in the file. That was when I started digging. It took 19 days to put this file together." He didn't ask why she'd remained silent. He didn't ask a single question. He simply stood, walked past the 4 empty chairs between them, pulled out the chair beside her, and sat down. Then he spoke in the same low, rough voice she'd first heard through the narrow opening of the coffee shop door close to 2 o'clock in the morning. "It wasn't your fault." Maren lowered her head. No one had said those words to her in 3 years. Not the hospital administrators, not the union, not the colleague who had stood less than 3 feet from her inside operating room number 4 that night and afterwards stopped answering her messages. Not her mother, who had only asked what she intended to do now. No one. And the worst part was that at some point, Maren herself had stopped saying those words in her own mind. She sat there with both shoulders trembling, and she didn't cry aloud. She only breathed in short, rapid bursts, and Cormac didn't touch her. He simply sat beside her with one elbow resting on the table, and he remained there until she could breathe normally again. Maren couldn't sleep that night. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, she left her room to get some water and saw a light glowing in the kitchen. Not the ceiling light, but the low yellow glow of the small table lamp placed in the corner of the shelf. Cormac sat there alone with his back to the doorway. On the stone counter in front of him, a gun had been taken apart piece by piece and arranged in a horizontal row on a canvas cloth, and he was cleaning the parts with a scrap of white fabric. Maren stopped at the threshold. She meant to turn away. Then she looked more closely and saw that the gun wasn't the one he usually carried. It was old, the steel worn dull in the places where hands had touched it most often, with a long diagonal scratch across the grip. "Whose is that?" she asked. Cormac didn't turn around. "My brother's," he said. He picked up the cylinder, wiped the inside, set it down, then picked it up again. He cleaned it once more, then again. Maren watched him repeat the movement 3 times, and she understood that the thing he was cleaning had been spotless for a long time. She walked into the kitchen, pulled out the chair across the counter from him, and sat down. He still didn't look at her. "He worked at the harbor for 11 years before he took that seat," Cormac said, his voice sounding as though he were continuing a story he'd been telling in empty kitchen for the past hour. He knew everyone's name. He remembered who owed money for hospital bills. "I can't remember any of it. I have to write it down." He lifted the slide and wiped along the groove. "For 10 years, I've done this job by controlling everything," he said. "I know who stands at which pier and at what hour. I know which route every shipment takes and who signs the paperwork. I know which person in the Halloran family wants to replace which other person. I've held this position for 10 years not because I'm better than anyone else, but because I can keep track of more things." He set the slide down. "And yet I sat there for 3 years, he said. "For 3 years, I believed my brother died on that operating table, because they couldn't save him in time. I went to his funeral, I paid the hospital bills, and I thanked every person on the surgical team that night. I shook the attending surgeon's hand in the hallway and told him thank you for doing everything you could. 3 years. And the thing that killed him was sitting in a pharmacy log in the hospital basement, 4 floors below where I stood." He picked up the white cloth and wiped the cylinder again. "If I controlled things as well as I thought I did, I would have known during the first week," he said. Maren looked down at his hand. The bandage she'd wrapped 3 days earlier had been removed and clumsily put back on, and over the middle knuckle, where the deepest cut had been, a red stain had soaked through the fabric and was spreading with every movement of his hand. He didn't look down at it. He didn't feel it. He picked up the barrel. Maren reached across the counter and closed her hand around his wrist. "Stop," she said. Cormac looked up, and for the first time since the night he'd sat outside her coffee shop in the snow, Maren saw that his eyes were no longer calm and unreadable. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd grown accustomed to that gaze, the gaze of a man calculating, weighing, measuring the worth of everything before him. It was gone now. What remained belonged to a 31-year-old man sitting in a kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, cleaning his brother's gun. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked down at his hand as though someone had only just pointed it out to him. Maren didn't forgive him. She didn't tell him he was a good man, because he wasn't, and she'd seen enough during the past 3 weeks to know that clearly. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, because some parts of it were his fault. She only said the thing that was true, the thing she'd known for weeks but hadn't spoken aloud. "You didn't force me to hold that needle," she said. "I opened the door that night. The bat was beneath the counter. I could have left you outside. I could have called the police. I could have done 10 other things. I chose for myself." She tightened her hand lightly around his wrist, then released it. "There's something else," she said. "Do you remember how, during the first few weeks, I asked you every day when I could go home?" "Yes," he said. "I haven't asked in weeks." Cormac said nothing. He looked at her, and she saw that he understood exactly what she'd just told him, because it was something she herself had only just understood. He raised his hand slowly, slowly enough to give her time to move away. She didn't. His fingers stopped halfway between them, close enough for her to feel their warmth without being touched, and they remained there for a long moment in that space of less than a handspan, listening to each other breathe. Then Maren leaned forward. The kiss wasn't long. There was nothing cinematic about it. It smelled of gun oil and antiseptic, and tasted of someone who hadn't slept in 3 nights. And when they drew apart, both of them were breathing a little more heavily than usual, and neither said anything. Cormac rested his forehead against hers for exactly 3 breaths. Then he leaned back in his chair. Maren stood, went to the cabinet beneath the sink, took out the first aid kit, and returned. She placed it on the counter beside the pieces of the gun. "Give me your hand," she said. He did. She cut away the old bandage, cleaned the wound again, and wrapped it from the beginning, properly this time, tighter than before. He sat still and let her work. When she finished, she closed the kit, but she didn't stand up. She reached for the white cloth on the counter, pulled the canvas a little closer, and picked up the cylinder. "You were wiping against the direction of the grooves," she said. "When there are grooves, you have to follow them." Cormac looked at her for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth moved, the same slight movement she'd first seen in the coffee shop kitchen when she'd threatened to charge him for the scissors. He picked up the slide, and the two of them sat there cleaning the remaining parts without saying anything more, until the darkness outside softened into the pale gray of an early January morning over the harbor water. The following Sunday, Marlow Ridge still had the Christmas tree standing in the corner of the common room, even though New Year's Day had passed 2 weeks earlier. Its tiny lights blinking slowly among the branches, and drawing paper and several boxes of colored pencils had already been laid out on the long table beside the window for the afternoon activity. Ezra sat at the end of the table with a cup of hot chocolate half gone in front of him and a sheet of paper he was coloring. He was filling in a blue patch, moving back and forth over the same place, pressing the pencil down hard and evenly. Marin pulled out the chair beside him, removed her scarf, and took out her phone. "I'll play the one from Wednesday for you," she said. "The one where I told you about the customer who knocked over an entire tray." She turned on the speaker and placed the phone face up on the table between them, and her voice came through the device, warmer and gentler than the voice she used anywhere else, the voice she reserved for these recordings. Ezra kept coloring. He didn't look at the phone, but his head tilted slightly toward it, and Marin knew he was listening. She had learned how to recognize that a long time ago. Out in the hallway, Cormac stood a few steps from the doorway. This time, he had come inside the building with her, instead of waiting in the parking lot, and when his phone vibrated, he stepped into the hall to answer it. The common room door remained open, and his voice carried inside, not loudly, only enough to be heard. "No," he said. "Postpone it. I'm not meeting anyone at Pier number 4 this week. Tell him that if he wants to talk, he can come himself." Ezra's hand stopped. The colored pencil froze in the middle of the blue patch. He lifted his head and turned his entire body toward the doorway, and Marin saw her brother's whole body stiffen in a way she'd never witnessed during the past 3 years. "Ezra," she called. He didn't look at her. He stared at the door. Then he began to speak. He spoke slowly and with great difficulty, each sound emerging as though it had to be pulled from somewhere very deep inside him, his mouth twisting with the effort. But it was clear. 3 characters, 1 letter, followed by 2 numbers. He stopped. He drew in a breath. Then he said them again, exactly the same, then a 3rd time, louder now, and he raised his hand and struck the table once for each sound, 1 blow per character, as though he were hammering them into the wood. Marin sat frozen. Then her hand moved to the pocket of her coat. She always carried some of her brother's drawings there, folded into quarters. She collected them every Sunday and had never thrown a single one away. She pulled them out, opened them flat across the table, and looked down. 3 years of tangled, overlapping pencil marks. 3 years of circles and slashes the doctors had told her not to search for meaning in, and in the middle of those marks, across one page and then another and another, written large and crooked, pressed so hard that the characters had left impressions on the reverse side, repeated again and again, were those same 3 characters. The exact 3 characters he had just spoken aloud. Marin covered her mouth with one hand. She had held these pages hundreds of times. She had folded them, stored them in a drawer, and some weeks had even used the blank sides to write grocery lists. She had sat through the first year's consultation and nodded while they explained that it was repetitive behavior, that she shouldn't search for meaning in it, that she would only exhaust herself, and she had believed them. Not because she was lazy, because believing them was much easier than accepting that her brother had been trying to tell her something for 3 years, and no one had been willing to sit down and listen. Ezra was still striking the table with his hand. "I hear you now," Marin said, and her voice broke. "I hear you, Ezra. I hear you now." She took his hand and held it still, and he allowed her to hold it. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I hear you now." Cormac had appeared in the doorway without her noticing. He didn't ask a question. He looked at the paper on the table, then at Ezra, then took out his phone and stepped back into the hallway. Marin heard him read the 3 characters into the phone, then add a few more words. 3 years ago, Massachusetts. Search everything. 30 minutes later, when they had reached the parking lot, his phone vibrated. He answered. He didn't speak throughout the entire call, only said understood once at the end, then hung up and slipped the phone into his pocket. "What is it?" Marin asked. Cormac opened the car door for her. "Get in," he said. He didn't say another word on the drive back. He sat in the front passenger seat, staring straight through the windshield, one hand resting on his thigh, his fingers completely still. Gus looked at him twice through the rearview mirror, then stopped. Marin sat in the back, still holding the drawings open and flat in her hands, and she asked once more when the car turned onto the road beside the harbor. But Cormac only said, "I need to verify something." The car stopped in front of the warehouse. Cormac got out first and entered through the side passage, but he didn't take the elevator. He turned toward the stairs leading down to the basement. The long concrete basement where Marin had practiced shooting during 4 lessons. He passed the sandbags, continued to the end of the corridor, and stopped at a wooden door she had never noticed before. Beyond it was a small room crowded with steel filing cabinets, the old 4-drawer kind used in freight offices decades earlier. He switched on the light. He walked along the row of cabinets, reading the label on each drawer, and stopped at one pressed against the far wall. He pulled open the second drawer. Inside were hardbound files arranged upright by year. He removed the file from 3 years earlier and opened it on top of the cabinet. It was the vehicle registry for the Fallon transport fleet. A typed list with 1 vehicle on each line, its identification code, type, year of manufacture, and license plate. He traced 1 finger down the column on the right. He moved slowly, line by line, through the first page and onto the second. Halfway down the second page, his finger stopped. Cormac Fallon stood there for a very long time. He didn't lift his hand. He didn't turn the page. He stood inside the basement records room beneath a single light, staring down at the 3 characters a 22-year-old man at Marlow Ridge had been trying to say for 3 years, and those 3 characters were listed in the license plate column of a vehicle registered to his own family. A call came at 9 o'clock the following morning, and by 9:20, everyone on the floor knew. Padraig Halloran wanted a meeting, not through an intermediary, not at the usual neutral location, but inside an abandoned cold storage warehouse in Chelsea, on the other side of the city, and he wanted it that very night. Cormac listened to the entire message, then set the phone down on the dining table. "He chose his timing well," Gus said. "Yes," Cormac replied. "You can't go." Cormac stood, walked to the window, and remained there for a while, looking down at the water. Then he said, "I'm going." Gus began to object, and Cormac raised one hand. "I need 48 hours, Cormac said. "I need every fleet register from 3 years ago checked again, every shift log, every key sign out record, all of it. My people are spread across the harbor because he's forcing me to hold the piers. If he wants a meeting, I'll give him one. He draws me across to Chelsea. I take 20 men with me, and for those 4 hours the harbor is clear, which means the men working in the records room downstairs can do their job undisturbed." He turned and looked at Gus. "You stay here." Gus shook his head. "If he goes, I go." "No," Cormac said. "You stay here." By 6 o'clock that evening, the building was almost empty. Marin stood in the kitchen watching groups of men pass through the elevator, and she saw Gus arguing with Cormac in a low voice at the far end of the hallway one more time before he finally walked away toward the stairs, his face dark with anger. A little before 7, Cormac came to her. He lifted her hand and placed a plastic card and a small folded piece of paper in her palm. "The elevator code," he said. "This opens the basement and the bottom door of the stairwell. From now on, you can go anywhere in this building." Marin looked down at her hand. There it was, the thing she'd sat on the cold concrete stair thinking about for an entire night back in December. "You're giving me this when you're about to leave," she said. "I'm giving it to you because I'm about to leave," Cormac replied. He held her hand for one more beat. "You're going to lose more," he said. "But this time, you won't lose it alone." Then he released her and stepped into the elevator. At 8:14 that evening, the lights went out. They didn't flicker. They didn't fade. They vanished all at once across the entire floor, and the low hum of the ventilation system that ran beneath the floor day and night stopped with them. Marin was standing at the sink. She set the cup down very gently. The warehouse had a backup generator. She knew because Gus had shown her the electrical panel in the basement the week before, and told her that if the power failed, it would return in 10 seconds. She counted. 10, 20, 30. Nothing happened. In the darkness, Marin moved 3 steps to the left, opened the second drawer beneath the stone counter, and took out the small pistol Cormac had left for her. She checked the magazine with one finger, inserted it again, and pulled back the slide. Then she didn't return to her bedroom. She had already thought about this. During the nights, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, and she had reached one very simple conclusion. A locked door didn't save anyone. A locked door only told the person searching where to look. She pressed her back against the wall and began moving along it, out of the kitchen and around the edge of the large room, avoiding the open center where the city lights shone through the row of windows. She entered the narrow hallway leading toward the bedrooms and stopped at the bend, where the corridor turned sharply, and a recessed section of wall formed a hiding place, just wide enough for one person. She crouched low. She waited. The elevator didn't move, but at the far end, she heard the emergency door open, the sound of heavy hinges, then footsteps. 3 men. She counted them by sound rather than sight, and she counted 3. They didn't speak to one another. They separated, one heading toward the kitchen, one toward the main room, and one walking directly into the hallway where she waited. Flashlights mounted beneath their guns swept white bands across the walls. Marin pressed her cheek against the cold plaster and heard her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she did exactly what Cormac had forced her to practice in the basement until her wrist had gone numb. Index finger along the frame. Don't place it on the trigger until you've made your decision. The beam drew closer. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to the bend, less than 6 feet from her, and for 1 second, the entire hallway held nothing but the breathing of 2 people. Marin had made her decision. The muzzle flash turned the whole corridor white for a fraction of a second before darkness swallowed it again, and the gunshot struck both narrow walls and came crashing back until her ears filled with a solid ringing. A body fell onto the wooden floor, and a flashlight rolled away, its beam circling across the ceiling before coming to rest. Someone shouted from the main room. Then bullets struck the wall above her head in a burst, muffled by a suppressor, and Marin flattened herself against the floor as white plaster dust poured over her hair and shoulders, fine as flour. She crawled backward along the wall with her left hand covering her face and heard footsteps running toward her. Then 2 more shots came, not from in front of her, but from behind the man who was running, from the direction of the elevator. The second shot was followed by the sound of another body falling. Marin lay perfectly still in the darkness, the pistol still aimed down the hallway, her heart beating so violently she thought she might vomit. At the far end, the emergency door slammed against the wall, and footsteps raced down the concrete stairs, fast and fading, 3 floors, then disappeared completely. Then silence. The emergency lights overhead came on, a row of small red bulbs running along the hallway, not bright enough to show details, but enough to reveal shapes. Marin slowly sat up. She walked toward the elevator with the gun still in her hand, her feet moving through the layer of white dust covering the floor. Gus Delaney was sitting with his back against the wall beside the elevator, one leg stretched straight out, his left hand pressed hard against his side. His gun lay on the floor beside his thigh, and he made no attempt to pick it up. He raised his face toward her, and beneath the red light, his skin looked gray as ash. Marin dropped to her knees, pushed his hand aside so she could see, and began speaking. "I need towels. I need something to press against this. Can you hear me, Gus?" He caught her wrist and held it. "You need to listen to me," he said. His voice was low and hurried. "You have to hear this before he comes back." Marin pulled her wrist free from his grip. "You can tell me later," she said. "Right now, I need to put pressure on this." Gus caught her again, harder this time. "No," he said. "Now." Then he said the first thing that made her stop moving. I opened the elevator door. Marin settled back on her heels. Under the red emergency lights, his face was impossible to read. "It wasn't for money," Gus said. "I need you to know that. Not a single dollar." He drew a breath, and it broke halfway through. 3 years ago, he said. The night of February 9th. Marin didn't move. "I was assigned to follow Brannon," Gus said. "I spent 11 years following those 2 brothers. That night, I stood in the hallway at Mercy General from 11 o'clock. At 1:17 in the morning, the doctor came out and spoke to Cormac, and I was standing 4 steps away, and I heard every word." He swallowed. "Then I went out to the parking lot. I kept a bottle of liquor in the trunk, an old habit. I sat in the car and drank half of it. I couldn't drive. I knew I couldn't drive, but I drove." Marin heard her own voice from very far away. 2 blocks from the hospital," she said. Gus closed his eyes. There was someone standing on the sidewalk, he said. Waiting for someone. It was snowing. I didn't see him in time. I don't remember whether I hit the brakes. He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. I stopped, he said. I got out of the car. I walked over to him, bent down, and saw that he was still breathing. I saw clearly that he was still breathing. Then I stood up, got back in the car, and left. Maren said nothing. Outside, far below on the street, a siren passed and slowly faded away. The Hallorans had someone watching the hospital that night, Gus continued. They were outside in the parking lot, watching which Fallon people came and went. They saw everything. They stayed silent for a year. Exactly 1 year later, a man came to see me and showed me a photograph of the car I had driven that night, with every character of the license plate clearly visible. From that day on, I belonged to them. His breath shook as he let it out. For 3 years I gave them small things. Which routes the vehicles took. Who met with whom. Small things, I kept telling myself. Just small things. Tonight, they told me to open the elevator door, or by morning everyone in this building would know who I was. He looked at her. I opened it, he said. I opened it and left. I was halfway to pier number 2 when I turned around. He stopped for a moment, then finished. I've been a coward for 3 years. I didn't want to be one for another 10 minutes. Maren sat on the wooden floor with white plaster dust still clinging to her hair and shoulders, facing this man. The man who had handed her a hot cup of coffee when she'd climbed back up from the concrete stairwell on her first night. The man who ate 2 slices of toast every morning and never 3. The man who had turned his back in the Marlow Ridge parking lot so she could say everything she needed to say without a third person watching. The man who had driven her to visit her brother 4 times. 3 weeks earlier, she had sat in that kitchen drinking the coffee he'd made and asked him what kind of man Cormac Fallon was, and he'd told her about a warehouse roof at 3 o'clock in the morning, about people who carried no line inside their minds. The elevator moved. The doors opened, and Cormac stepped out. He looked at Gus sitting against the wall, at Maren on the floor, at the white dust covering the hallway, and he showed no surprise at any of it. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, I've known since last night. Gus closed his eyes. The fleet register, Cormac said. The keys to that vehicle were signed out at 10 o'clock on the night of the 9th and returned at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 10th. There was only one signature on both lines. He said nothing more about it. He stepped forward, drew the gun from its holster, and didn't aim it at anyone. He lowered himself onto one knee, placed it on the wooden floor in front of Maren, and pushed it toward her. It wasn't so she could shoot. All 3 people in that hallway understood that. He did it because over the past 3 years, one person had lost a brother, and another had lost a brother, and tonight only one of them had the right to decide, and he knew that person wasn't him. Maren looked at the gun. She looked at it for a very long time, long enough for Gus to open his eyes and see what was happening. She thought of a Sunday afternoon 1 week earlier, of a blue patch colored over and over on a sheet of paper, of 3 characters pressed down so hard that they had left marks on the other side. She thought of the 3 years during which a 22-year-old man had tried to speak those 3 characters while everyone, including his own sister, had told themselves there was no point searching for meaning in them. Then Maren reached out and pushed the gun aside. It slid across the wooden floor and stopped against the wall. In my brother's accident report, she said, the line naming the person responsible was filled in with 2 words. Unknown driver. She looked at Gus. I've read that line at least 100 times. I want your name written there. She stood, and she delivered the final words while looking down at him. Go write it yourself. Then she turned to Cormac. Call the vehicle, she said. He needs to live long enough to sign that paper. Cormac took out his phone and pressed a number, and as it rang, he looked at the woman standing in the hallway with white plaster dust in her hair, and he understood something he would carry with him for a very long time. For the past 3 months, he'd believed he was the stronger person in the room. He was the one with the building, the vehicles, the men, and the access codes. He was the one who decided whether she stayed or left. He had placed the gun on the floor to offer her what he believed was the greatest power he could give another person, the power to take a life. She pushed it aside as though she were moving a dirty cup. In 10 years of holding his position, he'd never met anyone capable of doing that. People either took the weapon or refused it while trembling with fear. She wasn't afraid, and she didn't take it. She demanded that a name be written into a blank line in a hospital record, and he knew very well that what she had just demanded carried far more weight than what he had offered. Gus Delaney lived. 2 weeks later, when he was able to sit upright again, he went in and gave his statement on his own, without a lawyer and without bargaining for any conditions, and he remained in the interview room for 4 straight hours. He told them everything about the night of February 9th, everything about the 3 years that followed, the names of the people who had come to see him, and every piece of information he had passed along. 3 days later, in the line identifying the person responsible for Ezra Holloway's accident, the words "unknown driver" were crossed out and replaced with a name. Maren read the copy of that page 3 times, then folded it and slipped it into her coat pocket. But Gus's statement also dragged Halloran into the light, and a cornered animal always bites. 2 days later, a message arrived. Padraig Halloran offered to stop everything, withdraw from the piers, and bring the entire matter to an end in exchange for one condition: hand over the woman. The third man who had escaped the building that night had seen her face and had reported who she was. 3 years earlier, Halloran had bought a pharmacy technician to murder a man, and the only person still alive who remembered and could sit down and recount every minute inside operating room number 4 that night was Maren Holloway. As long as she was breathing, his entire empire hung by a thread. Cormac read the message, set his phone down, and told the men in the room to prepare to move on every pier that very night. Maren stood in the kitchen doorway and heard everything. "How many men will you lose?" she asked. He didn't answer. "How many, Cormac?" "Half," he said. "Maybe more." "Then no," she said. That night, she told Gus to have someone take her back to Ferris Street. She climbed the 14 wooden steps, opened the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet beside her bed, and for the first time in 3 years, she opened the ivory-colored envelope that had browned at all 4 corners. Inside was a hospital form, faded along the folds, the instrument and supply count sheet from operating room number 4 on the night of February 9th. It listed the case number and the starting time. It contained the first and second gauze counts. It carried the name of every member of the surgical team, written in her own hand at the beginning of the shift, according to procedure. And on the final line were her signature and a date and time stamp. On the night she was forced out of her job, she had brought it home without knowing why. For 3 years, it had remained in the darkness of a drawer. Now Maren held it and understood that it was the only surviving proof in the world that she had stood inside that room, and that she knew who had entered, who had left, and at what time. The next morning, she went to meet Padraig Halloran alone. She didn't carry a gun. She carried an envelope. The meeting took place in a small office above a pawn shop, and he made her wait 15 minutes to remind her of her place. When he finally sat down, Maren didn't greet him. She pushed the envelope across the desk. Inside were a copy of the count sheet, a copy of the pharmacy technician's statement, and her own notarized declaration. 11 pages, recording every minute of the night of February 9th, from 9 o'clock in the evening until 1:17 in the morning. "The originals have been sent to 3 places," she said. "A law office in Providence, a newspaper, and one more place you don't need to know about. All 3 have instructions to open the envelopes and publish everything if I don't call to confirm that I'm safe before 9 o'clock tonight." Halloran stared at the papers for a long time. "What do you want?" he asked. "I don't want your money," Maren said. "I don't want anyone to die. I want you to withdraw from the piers, exactly as you offered, and I want you to leave the coffee shop on Ferris Street and the facility at Marlow Ridge, alone for the rest of your life." She stood. "3 years ago, you destroyed my life with a piece of paper," she said. "I'm returning the favor with one." She left at 11 o'clock that morning and made the confirmation call at 8:50 that evening. Over the next 48 hours, Padraig Halloran lost everything. Not through a war, through phone calls, names withdrawing, and people who had once stood behind him suddenly becoming unavailable. Not a single shot was fired. 3 days later, Cormac sat on the edge of the bed in the room where traces of white plaster dust still clung to one corner of the ceiling, and he handed her a file. A new name, new documents, another city. Ezra would be transferred to the finest rehabilitation facility in the country, with every expense covered for life, already paid in full, with no conditions attached and no dependence on whether she chose to leave or stay. He placed the file on the blanket. "The car will be downstairs in 10 minutes, he said. "I'll never come looking for you." It was exactly what Maren had begged for during those first weeks. She looked down at the papers, then at the man sitting before her, the man who had controlled half the harbor for 10 years, and she saw that his hands were trembling. She leaned forward and kissed him, and when she drew back, she spoke slowly, each word clear. "You're going to lose more, Cormac, but this time, you won't lose it alone." He closed his eyes and released a long breath. "But you still owe me for the window," she added. 2 months later, all the snow had melted. Ferris Street Coffee reopened on an April morning with new glass and a new frame, and Estelle stood on the sidewalk with her hands on her hips, criticizing the paint color. The old brass bell still hung in its original place above the door, bent on one side and ringing with a slight rasp, because Marin had refused to replace it. An envelope arrived from the Delaney family. Inside was a crayon drawing of a coffee shop with yellow windows and a red-haired woman standing behind the counter, signed Bertie in large letters. Marin taped it to the wall beside the espresso machine. By the window, Ezra sat in his wheelchair, drinking hot chocolate, holding a pencil over the sheet of paper in front of him. And that day he managed to say 3 words, and to Marin, those 3 words were an entire spring. At 7 o'clock that evening, the bell above the door rang once, clear and rough. Cormac stepped inside, bringing with him the last trace of cold from the street, and he turned the sign on the door from open to closed, as he did every evening. Marin watched him from behind the counter and said nothing. She was no longer the woman standing behind a locked door at 2 o'clock in the morning, deciding whether to open it for a bleeding stranger. She was now the person who decided who was allowed to cross that threshold, and in all 27 years of her life, no one had ever given her that before. Some people have one thing after another taken from them: their parents, their profession, their name, even the voice of someone they love. And still, on a winter night, they stand up and open the door for a stranger. Kindness isn't innocence. It is the final form of courage left when a person has nothing else to lose, and the truth, even when it arrives 3 years late, can still return a person's own name to them. If the story of Marin and Cormac touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And if you had been Marin on that first snowy night, would you have opened the door? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.